Hi, Lauren.
Hi, Matt.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so excited to chat with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
What is the full name of the department in which you are currently doing your master's at Cambridge?
That's a tough question.
Sorry, I didn't mean to start with a hard one.
It's okay. So the full name is the MPhil in History and Philosophy and Sociology. That's the new one, added a couple months ago. In Science, Medicine, and Technology.
Wow.
Yeah. And they might even add a couple more.
Okay, cool. So currently 6 fields covered.
Yes.
With
one. Potential for more.
Potential for more.
You don't want to leave people out.
Any combination of these is possible. You can do
Yes.
1, you can do 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Believe it or not, you are not the first person on this channel that we're interviewing from this department. We interviewed a course mate of yours a couple weeks ago. But I wanted to first ask which of these 6 things you specialize in, or all of them.
So I don't do philosophy because that's scary. So I focus on history of science and medicine. But I would say more history of medicine.
History of medicine.
Yeah, with the focus on history of medical cartography.
Huh.
Which is a bit specific.
Cartography meaning?
Maps.
Maps.
Yes.
The M word.
Mm-hmm.
I get the sense that we're going to be talking a lot about maps.
I love maps.
That's very exciting. Okay, so how did you choose this program? Was it just where maps fit in best? Is there you can't get a degree in cartography in and of itself at Cambridge?
No.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, well, for me, it was I wanted to study specifically historical cartography, so looking at some really interesting maps that were made in about the 19th century. And so my background was a lot of it centered more in like biology with sort of a side interest in history. And then I realized that there were maps of disease, specifically cholera, which became like super popular to make these maps in the 1800s. And then realized there were a bunch of these maps of cholera that people haven't really looked at before. And a lot of them happen to be in Cambridge. And I think this program is super interesting because you have most people coming from backgrounds in the sciences, biology, medicine, etc., who love history but also love the sciences. And so I think this program lets me like draw on that background but then go like hardcore in the history.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So it's a program for polymaths. It's a program for people who
yes.
just know everything.
Basically.
Like you. Very cool. That's wonderful. So you said your background is in history and biology, these 2 unrelated fields.
Very unrelated.
Okay, cool. So do you do your undergrad in one or both of the 2?
So I did my undergrad in biology, like molecular biology, and then actually most of my research in undergrad was in structural biology. And like biochemistry. Mm-hmm. But then like about midway through undergrad, I took this history class all about maps with this amazing professor, and we basically looked at maps every class, and they sort of taught us how to really like probe the details of things and keep asking questions and searching for information and trying to ask, why is this map portraying something in a certain way? Because I think part of the reason why I love maps is that I think people often take for granted sort of that maps are projections of reality when in actuality they're incredibly subjective, and every single thing on the map is really just the product of complicated decision-making process. And so I think that class showed me that maps are just really amazing and beautiful documents, and they've kind of often been sort of ignored in historical research. So starting about sophomore, junior year of undergrad, I started doing history research on the side just for fun and got really into it.
Research on the side. Mm-hmm. What were you researching?
So the research I did in undergrad was focused on some maps of cholera in Oxford, actually, since I studied abroad there for a bit. And there's this very famous map of cholera made by this guy named John Snow, who's sort of regarded as like the father of epidemiology. Okay. And so he makes a super famous map in 1855. And he plots all the cases of where cholera was in this area in London. And then he uses this map to argue that cholera was spread through the water, which was a very controversial opinion at the time. And so this map is often regarded as like one of the first maps ever to show that cholera is being spread through the water, and it is generally kind of viewed, at least among like historians of cartography, as like the very first map of disease. And so I kind of just went along with that. But then I was in the Bodleian Library at Oxford and was looking at some old manuscripts on people who are writing about what causes cholera and why, and I found this map that was sort of like tucked into the very back of the book, and I like unfolded it, and I was super excited because A, I love maps, but B, it was a map of cholera that was before the John Snow map, and was really actually quite sophisticated. Like, it plotted all the cases of cholera and potential unsanitary sites in like really great detail. And so that kind of got me started thinking about, you know, wow, there's actually a lot of maps of cholera, potentially of other diseases that predate the John Snow map and that have largely been ignored by historical scholarship. And I think that's where things really sort of got going, and then I kept sort of doing research on that throughout the rest of my undergrad.
This was your aha moment of
yes,
the map is
yes,
the insight into so many things
yes,
that people don't realize.
And I think what's interesting about these maps of disease is that they're often in these medical sort of manuscripts, and so that means that they're maps in books. And a problem you have with maps in books is that they're never cataloged as maps. So like, I can't just go to a library catalog and search cholera map because nothing's going to come up for that. Instead, for example, if I go and look through a ton of books about cholera, I basically just go and look in the back of the books, and you often find these beautiful maps that just fold out. They're often huge, like the size of a table or multiple tables. Like, I get weird looks in the library. And yeah, these maps are really quite prevalent in the 1800s, but haven't really been discussed at all because they are so hidden and because they are in these books that aren't really looked at that much anymore.
I see. Mm-hmm. And so they're kind of in this intersection between these two fields, and because they don't classify necessarily as precisely history or precisely science.
Exactly.
Hence the usefulness of this program that you're currently in, to be able to connect these two things. Mm-hmm. So why do you think this is kind of an understudied field? Like, why are people not doing this work that obviously is important and fascinating and allows you to do some kind of detective work, almost like looking in the backs of works? Like, why has it been overlooked?
I think a large part of it is that generally, so the first part of that answer to that question, I think, is that the history of cartography is somewhat overlooked. Maps don't really fit into one specific area in general. They're like objects on one hand, they're also images, they're also artwork, and so they don't necessarily fit into a particular discipline. And you see this even in the sort of departments that people are in who study history of cartography. They might be in a geography department, or more of an actual mapping department, or even a literature department. I mean, it really varies, which I think is wonderful. And then I think the other part of it is that with these maps of disease, they aren't something you would necessarily display on a wall, right? They're not something that will necessarily have been preserved really well, and so they are really just sort of hidden in the back of these medical manuscripts. And I think unless you have a reason to be looking at the medical manuscripts, or you just like super like maps and are like trying to find maps everywhere, then you probably aren't going to come across them.
Wow.
I think, interestingly though, these maps themselves are quite stunning. Like, the ones I'm studying now were made during the late 1800s, and the British, in British India, you have a huge number of these maps being made, which is really interesting, and nobody's really talked about this before. And I think that in this case, these maps are incredibly extravagant. I mean, they're the size of like I said, like a table or multiple tables, incredibly bright colors. People talk about how much time they spend making these maps. Incredible amount of resources were spent making these maps as well. And so even though I think we might not necessarily expect to find these super incredible, colorful maps in these books, I think it's important that when we do, we take the time to think about what they mean and why they're there. And I think people, because they haven't been looking at these documents before necessarily, they've missed that. But I think once you see it, it's the kind of thing where you say, wow, this is, well, maybe just because I like maps, but I do think when you see these maps, you say, wow, there's something here. Like, there has to be a reason why you're spending so many resources to make this.
Definitely, especially with disease-based maps. I would not have expected so much work on like the artistic almost element of it to be talking about such a grotesque kind of topic.
Yes.
But that's a fascinating combination between the two. So because this topic is kind of overlooked overall,
Mm-hmm.
do you find that you're often one of the first people in kind of an academic setting to study these maps? Like they've been forgotten about for centuries, and then you're truly the first to look at, like, are you basically not looking at previous papers in doing your own research?
Yeah, I would say that's correct. Yeah, I mean, the way I've been actually doing my research most recently is I go to the British Library and they have these old printed sort of volumes which describe all the different annual sanitary reports.
Mm-hmm.
So these sanitary reports were made in colonial India in the late 1800s, and I've noticed that a lot of them include maps, actually almost all of them,
Mm-hmm.
which is super exciting because there's literally hundreds and hundreds of maps there that no one has looked about, or maybe some people have looked at them, but if they have, they haven't written about them.
Yeah.
Because there's really no secondary literature on this like material source. So there's a super exciting archive just sort of waiting to be looked at and talked about, and none of these maps have been digitized either. So they're really interesting perspectives, one on cholera and plague, typhoid fever, other diseases in colonial India, but they're also, definitely displays of power and displays of administrative control, which is a whole nother sort of aspect that I'm super interested in as well. And I think, yeah, it's part of why it's so exciting is, you go to the library and it's so wonderful. They, like, give you a whole stack of boxes of these books. They're all wrapped up kind of like presents, and you have to, like, unwrap them and take the book out. And then I just, like, leaf through the book looking for maps, which are often folded. So there'll be these, like, super thick sort of folded things of paper, which don't look like much. But then if you unfold them, sometimes it'll be folded, like, 48 times or something crazy because they're huge. And you find just all these incredible maps hidden in these books that seem like no one has really looked at them before. And it seems like, and part of the research I'm doing now is showing that actually, even when they were made, for the contemporaries then, nobody was looking at them either. So these maps were largely made to be made and not so much to be used. They're very much sort of a display of, look at all this statistical information we know, look at what a great job I'm doing as a sanitary commissioner, look at how powerful we are, look at our administrative boundaries. But no one's actually using these to understand what the cause of cholera is and how it's being spread.
Right.
So, yeah, I would say in some cases, I feel like I'm maybe one of the few people who've ever sat down and looked at these maps, which is an exciting feeling.
I was going to say, that's such an exciting
It's so
feeling.
much fun.
All of us, so many of us here at Cambridge, I feel like, are more or less doing what has already been done before, but to be one of the first people to look at this stuff and write about them must feel like you're on the frontier of something very exciting.
It is, yeah. Just like when you flip open a page and you see this incredibly beautiful, colorful map with all these interesting statistical plots and stuff is just very exciting.
You're like an archaeologist, kind of.
Basically.
Do you feel a kinship kind of with the people who made these maps who are not doing it for anything? Like you're two people of the same blood or something like that.
The weird thing is, these people hated making the maps. They hated the maps with, like, a very strong passion. Like, it's interesting because usually my approach is I look at these maps and then I'll leaf through the whole book looking for any reference to the maps. Oftentimes there's no reference to the map because it was sort of just the government told them they had to make these maps and then they had to make them. But in the rare cases where there are references to these maps, usually it's like a long list of complaints about, like, how much time it took and, like, wow, like, I'm just a physician, you expect me to make a map now, how am I going to get all this data, what am I going to do with it, it's taking forever, I need more money, help. There's, like, literally these pleas for help saying that they don't know how to make a map, but the government told them they had to make one.
Wow.
And it seems like in some cases, this one report I was reading recently, this one person got very fed up and he wrote he just wasn't going to include it because how ridiculous would it be to use a map to show transmission of cholera. But then it seems he got fired, so that didn't work very well. So, like, they were very serious about these maps, but they weren't actually, the people making them, I don't think actually liked them, which is a bit strange.
That is strange.
Yeah.
So you're then unique.
I feel like I am much more excited about these maps than they ever were.
Okay, so tell us what your research specifically is for your MPhil.
Yeah, so I guess the MPhil, the structure is a bit interesting because you do papers on a couple different topics. So right now I'm working on my dissertation, which is somewhat of a continuation of my first essay. So I'm looking at basically trying to understand why these maps of cholera, plague, typhoid fever, other diseases in British India were so popular around the 1800s. So I'm looking at first, where did this idea come from to make these cholera maps? Sort of whose idea was it, why, what is sort of the rationale behind this? And then there's a lot of interesting questions with how are they actually making these maps? So there's sort of the base map, which is the map before you put any data on top of it, such as the data about the diseases that might be affecting this certain area. So I'm looking at where those maps came from and then how they gathered the data to put on the map. And then I think the kind of the most important part is asking, what is the purpose of this? Yeah. And you can see that partly by really scrutinizing the details of the map. So there's oftentimes clues within the map themselves. Perhaps there will be a key that'll define certain definitions and things like that that'll tell you what was important to these people making these maps and why. And then also looking about what people are saying about these maps. And sort of my hypothesis is that these maps were largely tools for administrative and imperial control. Even the process of collecting statistics is very much sort of a top-down process of enforcing this hierarchy. And so I think right now what I'm doing is mostly just looking at a ton of different maps and then from there looking more at what people are saying about these maps and trying to get a better sense of what these maps can tell us about public health in British India, but also sort of British colonial India more generally and how this fits into kind of state control.
Right.
Yeah.
I can see how subjectivity would be very important in this instance.
Yes.
So British India is what you're focusing on. Who were the people making the maps? Were they Indian people or people coming from abroad, colonists or...
So that's a really important question. And so it seems that, so these maps are made by these people called sanitary commissioners. Okay. So being a sanitary commissioner in the British Empire was actually like a very big deal because you got paid very well. Okay. So these sanitary commissioners are basically sort of in charge of public health, and they have sanitary commissioners at multiple different levels. So there's the presidencies, which is sort of the biggest level, then provinces and districts, and it goes on and on and on. There's just sort of in general with British India, you have multiple layers of sort of hierarchy. So these sanitary commissioners are tasked with making these maps. But these maps are definitely relying on like indigenous knowledge, and the actual statistics that they're using comes from the Indian people themselves who collect the data. And that collection of data is very much enforced by the British government. So they're enforcing that collection of data, often collecting data on deaths, for example, cholera, mortality, and other diseases. And that itself is like a very sensitive thing because you basically have British coming in and telling these people that they have to give them all this very personal information.
Right.
So then they take that information and I think in a sense plotting that information on this map, which is quite a public display, is very much part of reinforcing that hierarchy, which is sort of an interesting question that I'm looking at as well. Yeah.
That's fascinating. So do you see some shifty things going on between receiving the data and plotting it on the map? Like, are there changes? Like, was governmental figures, were they trying to shape something in a certain way, or kind of display the truth incorrectly or something? I don't know.
That's a very good question. I think in many cases, yes, it seems incredibly subjective. If you try and sort of trace back yourself to see what data is being plotted, sometimes you can even see the people making these maps struggling with this. So there's one map I was looking at where you can see, if you look very closely, that one number has been crossed off and turned into another number because they said, oh, these deaths from cholera were due to that other province next door. It's their fault, not mine. And so you have these sort of subtleties that you can find if you look quite closely.
Wow.
So there's that. There's also, these maps were very much, at least in some cases, used by the sanitary commissioners to show that they had really thoroughly investigated all the different potential unsanitary sites of their district or province. And so sometimes you'll see they'll actually trace the route that they took all throughout. And so there'll be like a little dotted line showing where they went, and to sort of advertise or sort of say, oh, look at how great of a job I did.
Yeah.
So a lot of making the maps is very much for that. in terms of the actual numbers of the data too, it seems like there is some fudging going on. And I think that's a super interesting question too, is if you can actually look at the data tables being made to use these maps. And in many cases, I cannot figure out how they translate the numbers into the map. And it's often very sort of vague. They'll just sort of shade an area that they say has cholera, or they'll make some different sort of schematic. And there's so many different strategies and styles used to display cholera as well. And I think that often, in many cases, the style that they choose is reflective of their interests. So whether they want to show that their province is very healthy, or whether they want to show that they have a really strong grasp of all the different administrative controls, so they'll plot all the different town and district boundaries. So it is incredibly subjective. And I think looking at those subtleties is where you can get a better sense of what the purpose of these maps were.
Right, and the intent behind
Exactly.
making them in the way they do. So what's an example of like two different styles that might be used, and what would the motivation behind using one be as opposed to the other?
So interestingly, I was trying to trace back to see who first said that we should make cholera maps, like who said that should be a thing. And there was this letter that was published and widely distributed all throughout British India that was written by this physician whose name was Dr. Gadiv, and he has this like great idea, he says, to make cholera maps. And he details in like incredibly really detailed instructions this sort of system that he says you should have. So in this system, he says you should make a map which has these sort of circular diagrams, and then you should divide it into quadrants, split it up into the different kinds of people, so the general population, he says like the native population, European soldiers, etc. And then you should have another circle surrounding it with the beginning date of the epidemic and the end date, and then another circle with the months that were most effective and shaded in, and it gets very complicated. So they send this instructions to everybody, and then everyone is scrambling to try and figure out how to actually implement this. And people realize that if you actually want to show all these details, which the government has said that you need to, you're going to have to make a giant map. So you see people making ridiculously big maps because of this. So there's one map actually in the library at Cambridge, which anyone can go and look at, and made by this guy named W.R. Cornish, sanitary commissioner from Madras. And he makes a map that literally I couldn't find a table big enough to display the map on, so I had to take it down to a different room in the library and get special permission. And it's the size of 3 tables all fit together, and it's huge. And they even complain about this. They say, oh, this map was rather bulky, we'll have to find a new one next year. So you see a lot of people trying to do this weird circle diagram thing that just doesn't work. And I think that circle diagram tactic is mostly just to comply with the government's wishes. But then you see other ones. For example, some of the ones I'm looking now are a bit smaller, and they're really just, the colors are striking. And if you look at these maps, you wouldn't really, unless you look closely, you might not even tell that these are maps of cholera. Instead, they just really look like maps of administrative boundaries. So in that case, I would say the people making those maps are very much interested in sort of using these maps of disease as more of a display of British control over local people. So there are definitely different styles. Sometimes I think out of convenience or practicality, oftentimes people will just be like, hey, can I take your map? And then they'll add some things on top of it. I've seen cases where they do that and then forget to add the things on top of it, and then it gets awkward. So there's a lot of different styles. And I think because there are literally hundreds and hundreds of these, it's amazing to see how people are sort of borrowing things from other people. And oftentimes, I think they actually envision sort of a bottom-up process where people would make maps at the town level and the district level, and you would compile these all into one grand map. But in reality, it just doesn't work at all because they are completely different.
Wow. So did people just give up by the end? Was there no cohesion, so no large enough map could have all the details? What was the course of
There's definitely, actually, it's pretty amazing looking at the evolution of these maps. So some of them really are incredibly effective data visualizations. And I think you see, for example, I think part of it is the advent of color lithography. So at the very beginning, the sort of lithographic printing presses that you have are mainly doing everything in black and white. And then if you want to add color, you would have to go back and do that by hand, which is very expensive. And they did do that, which is interesting because, I mean, to spend that kind of money on these documents is pretty unusual, I think. But then later in the 1800s, you see color zincography becomes a thing. And so now you have these maps that are actually using color to denote disease incidence. And those become sort of quite popular. Mm-hmm. But I think, and something that's super important is that even though these maps were maybe improving in a sense, the people making them noted that, and they really knew that there were a lot of issues with these maps. Mm-hmm. Because I think this is also partly why I love maps so much, is that you really can't pinpoint anything down to a map, especially something like disease, which is so fluid and doesn't really know borders. And I think you see them struggling with that here as well.
Yeah. Fascinating. So are disease maps still made?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think part of the reason why I think this research is important to me is because I do think there is a lot to be learned about sort of current public health approaches by studying the approaches that people have used in the past. So I think these maps in particular, and for example, the maps I was studying before in Oxford, and as well as I think the ones of British India, you see that oftentimes they sort of will use these maps to portray an entire space or an entire group of people as diseased. Mm-hmm. And these maps are very much being used to define spaces as like healthy or unhealthy and make these sort of blanket statements. And I think that is sort of the danger of medical cartography. I think it's like a very powerful tool, an incredibly important tool, but it is definitely, you have to have like a very careful balance, right? Because I think even if we think about some of the maps we see today, whether it's like a map of malaria, HIV incidents, etc., we often will see, an entire country just like shaded in red. And I think if we take a minute to think about how maps are subjective and they're not just how the world is, I think we can also see similar sort of power dynamics at play today. And we can think, I think everyone would benefit from thinking a little bit more about how maps are very much subjective and can have pretty serious implications.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How cool is that? And I also wanted to ask you, so in terms of maps in day-to-day lives of people today, I know that like my parents, when growing up and even into their 20s, 30s, relied so heavily on physical paper maps, like from getting from one place to another, if you're doing a road trip, but also if you're just exploring a city or something like that.
Right.
And now with the digitization of maps, like I am incredibly reliant on Google Maps, say, to get anywhere. How do you feel like that process has affected the way we interact with maps? Do you avoid Google Maps? I mean, I assume you probably don't, but like what are we losing, what are we gaining in the digitization of maps?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think something I really like thinking about is in general is how people visualize space. And so I do think there is, when you have this sort of, I guess, sort of digital revolution, there is sort of a lot of things that are changing because of that. Something I do think about is what sort of like traces will be left behind for future historians. So I think for me, oftentimes I'm looking at these maps that maybe were used, maybe weren't used, and you can actually see these like hard copy maps as evidence of places changing over time, which I think is really interesting. And something that historians of cartography talk about a lot is that maps in general actually are pretty good at concealing change. And I think that things like maybe Google Maps is an example of that. You look at Google Maps and you don't necessarily think about, how is this place different? How it does, in a sense, sort of conceal things, because as soon as, for example, a building changes into a different building, an apartment block turns into a sort of company, etc., that's just suddenly how it is on Google Maps. And so I think that is, I don't know, it's something interesting that I like thinking about. I'm not sure exactly how like this change in going away from paper maps or changing how people are thinking about the world, but I do think just the fact that everyone now has Google Maps on their phone and many people, are using this all the time is quite interesting.
Yeah.
And Google Maps itself is very subjective as well. There's certain companies and businesses that are there and some that aren't there. And I think that itself is like a very interesting sort of question, how that might be affecting our perceptions of the world.
Right, exactly. What determines which restaurants pop up first when you zoom in on a certain spot or something like that.
Yeah.
It's kind of concerning.
Yeah.
But also just awareness about this kind of thing is step one, which is, I
Mm-hmm.
guess, to some degree, what you're doing, maybe unrelatedly, but that's super exciting. Yeah, so where do you plan to take these studies that you're doing right now into the future? Are you going to continue some map work, or are you going to continue some disease work, or both?
Yeah, I think my current plan, I think I would love to continue doing both. I think that sort of an understanding of history of public health, history of cartography, can definitely be improved by also sort of bringing more of a background of medicine into that. And looking to the future, I'm definitely interested in going into medicine, but I also want to keep doing history. So I'm, and I know this seems like very different things, but I do genuinely think that, especially for physicians, people working in public health, anyone in the medical field, I think it's incredibly important to know why policies are the way they are, to know what are the potential implications of certain public health approaches, to know how public health has been implemented throughout history. And I think asking what is the impact of medical cartography on perceptions of disease is a question that is important, but also just super interesting. I think in general, thinking about what impacts general perceptions and understanding of disease, health, medicine is really important for physicians and the medical community as a whole. And I think that also, I would say, if you sort of bring that sort of background in public health approaches, biomedicine to history, it can also let you ask certain questions that maybe you might not think of otherwise, or might not think is maybe important to ask if you didn't have that sort of background. So I think that maybe just because I'm so excited about both these areas, but I do really think that sort of being able to do that interdisciplinary work is super beneficial for both fields. And I think that's partly why I think the department here at Cambridge has been really exciting, because you have, I would say actually there's more people coming from science and medical backgrounds even than history backgrounds in undergrad. And so you have people asking questions that you would never maybe get expected to ask, like the really finite details of like what's the chemical composition of these maps that you're working with and things like that you might not expect. And I think those questions can be really helpful for deciding, where you want to go with your research.
That's so true. It seems almost progressive, this department, because it's defying the academic standard of this is history and this is math and this is whatever. Yeah. It's all intersectionality of fields, and goes to show, like you've said, how they're all related, and it's kind of limiting to look at any from any one particular viewpoint.
Yeah, and I think even the sort of materials that I'm using, I think that part of the reason why this project is so fun for me is that, each day I get to look at maps, but I also get to read a lot about what people thought was causing cholera, which I think is a super interesting sort of question. And I get to see how people were trying to understand medical statistics and things like that. And I think getting to sort of view all that different sort of material at once is really wonderful.
That is wonderful. I can say objectively what you're doing is wonderful. And it seems like you really enjoy it, which is...
I have so much fun.
That's amazing. And that's what I would hope all researchers would have. Anyway, thank you so much for talking with us.
Oh, thank you.
This was really, really fun.
Thanks so much. I had a great time.